This is Did You Know? CIUS Answers, a daily response to your questions about Russia's war against Ukraine. In response to the strong public interest to understand what is happening in Ukraine right now, CIUS experts are answering your questions. Answering your question today is Dr. David Marples. Dr. Marples is a distinguished professor in the Department of History, Classics, and Religion at the University of Alberta. He holds a research fellowship at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. David, can you please answer for us, is Belarus on Russia's side in this current war?
Yes, it is. At the moment, Belarus has not sent its own troops over the border, but it's very much on Russia's side. You know, the background to Belarus and where it is today is very unusual because just 2 years ago, there was a presidential election in Belarus, which saw massive public activity for the first time in many years, most of it on behalf of opposition candidates who all came from the Belarusian elite. And although, as in the past, the long-term president, Alexander Lukashenko, managed to curtail them by having the leaders either arrested or having them flee outside the country, a candidate emerged to challenge Lukashenko and use the campaigns of all three major figures in this election to back her up. So this was Sviatlana Tsikhanovskaya, who was an obscure schoolteacher with no political background, and she was backing up her husband, who'd been placed in jail, a well-known blogger. The other candidates at that time were a banker, former chairman of the Belarus Gazprom Bank, and also a former diplomat, Valery Sipkala, who was the former Belarusian ambassador to the United States and Mexico. So this campaign saw public activity motivated, I think, by the failure of the regime to respond to COVID crisis. And although Lukashenko claimed to have won the election on August the 9th, when the votes were announced, there were mass demonstrations that continued daily for many, many weeks, all the way through to the winter period. The demonstrators were arrested en masse. There are more political prisoners in Belarus today than there were any time during the Soviet period, over 1,000, in fact. Many fled abroad. So what you have is a president, really, who has been isolated within his own country and then pretty well cut off by the European Union from communication, and also by the United States and Canada, which have placed sanctions on Lukashenko and his chief officials. And the result of that is that Lukashenko has been reliant on Russia. And even though in the past he's always been pro-Russian, he's always been quite close to Russia, there's never been this kind of ultimate dependency as there has before. I'll give an example. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, Belarus officially remained neutral and acted, in fact, as a mediator in the Donbass war with the Minsk Accords of 2014 and 2015. Lukashenko tried to play a peacemaker role in that period rather than taking Russia's side. But since 2020-21, with the isolation, he's been very much dependent on Putin. And in fact, even the language between the two has begun to change to one of complete deference, that, you know, you are the boss, we will follow what you say. Russia has given Belarus loans. It's held military exercises on Belarusian territory. It's put pressure for an air force base to be formed in Belarus. And it's pretty well taken over the Belarusian media and foreign policy. There's no independent foreign policy making in Belarus right now. So this has put the two presidents together, but with Russia calling the shots. And Lukashenko is now in an almost perilous situation, I would say, because all the foreign companies that have pulled out of Russia in the past few days, from IKEA to DHL to American Express, et cetera, have all pulled out of Belarus as well. The Belarusian ruble has plummeted. It's losing about 5 times of its original value against the US dollar. It will go further down. Several banks are close to absolute closure. And on the stock exchange, Belarusian firms are suffering as well. And in terms of its national currency, it's really been relegated to junk status. Its credit rating is now at junk status. So as Russia goes, so goes Belarus. And I think the pressure that's been put on Russia is now going to have an impact on what's happening in Belarus. It doesn't mean, though, I would stress, that the Belarusian people support the war against Ukraine. All the evidence suggests, and history even suggests, that this is exactly the opposite. Belarusians have always had a friendly attitude toward Ukrainians. In fact, there are many Belarusians from the opposition who've been caught up in the war in Ukraine because they fled to Ukraine as a refuge from Lukashenko's police forces and being rounded up and arrested. Thousands and thousands of Belarusians ended up in Ukraine. So I don't know in terms of the longer term whether Belarus will actually commit its forces, especially its paratroopers, which I know Putin would like to take part in the war. But the chances are, if Putin demands it, Belarus will follow suit in the long term until Lukashenko goes. This will continue because in Belarus, you've got a regime in power that's close to a sort of Latin American style junta regime with no popular support and relying on the backing of a powerful outside state.
Thank you, David. And thank you to everyone who continues to send in their questions about Ukraine and the Russia's war against Ukraine.